This video is on the Civil War and Reconstruction. So this is a crazy time period in American history, and I think pretty interesting. And definitely, you're going to see some questions on the exam, so we need to be familiar with it. So as we get into the Civil War, a lot of times it seems like people think that uh, you know essentially the Civil War starts with Abraham Lincoln saying, "I don't believe in slavery," and then there's this big civil war between the South and the North, and that's true. That does happen, but it actually starts. There's a number of events that really lead to this, and the first big one, is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is in 1854. Okay, so it was passed by U.S. Congress on May 30th, 1854. You don't need to know the date, but you do need to be familiar with what it is. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed people in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. The act served to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which prohibited slavery north of a certain latitude. Okay, a couple years later, we have the Dred Scott versus Sanford U.S. Supreme Court. So this is in case, which is in 1857. It's usually just referred to as the Dred Scott case, and it was a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court on U.S. labor law and constitutional law. The case held that a Negro could not be an American citizen and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court, and that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in the federal territories acquired after the creation of the United States. Dred Scott, who was an enslaved man of the Negro African race, had been taken by his owners to free states and territories, attempted to sue for his freedom. In a 7-2 decision, the court denied Scott's request. The decision was only the second time that the Supreme Court had ruled an act of Congress to be unconstitutional. The decision immediately spurred dissent from anti-slavery elements in the North. The decision proved to be an indirect catalyst for the American Civil War. That's a key point for you to know, right? That could easily be a question on the exam, is that the Dred Scott case was an indirect catalyst for the American Civil War. It was functionally superseded by the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was after the Civil War, and by the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which was adopted in 1868, which gave African Americans full citizenship. So we'll go into those again in a minute. The Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case is unanimously denounced by scholars and regarded by most as the worst decision in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's saying something. In terms of the economies of the North and the South, they were very different, and this is, one of the reasons that the war really broke out. So Southerners made huge profits from cotton and slaves and fought a war to maintain them. Northerners did not need slaves for their economy and fought a war to free them. Therefore, the North had a focus on a manufacturing economy, while the South was focused on agriculture. Slaves were part of the South's economic system. Okay, and then we eventually get here to the Civil War. The American Civil War was fought in the U.S. from 1861 to 1865. The result of a long-standing controversy over slavery, war broke out in April 1861 when Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina shortly after President Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated. The Nationalists of the Union proclaimed loyalty to the U.S. Constitution. They faced secessionists of the Confederate States of America, who advocated for states' rights to expand slavery. So essentially what you have here then is the Union is the North and the Confederates is the South. The North and South quickly raised volunteer and conscription armies that fought mostly in the South over 4 years. The Union finally won the war when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at the Battle of Appomattox, followed by a series of surrenders by Confederate generals throughout the southern states. During his now famous Gettysburg Address, which he gave in 1863, Lincoln reiterated the principles of human equality espoused by the Declaration of Independence and proclaimed the Civil War as a struggle for the preservation of the Union, sundered by the secession crisis, with a new birth of freedom that would bring true equality to all of its citizens. Lincoln also redefined the Civil War as a struggle not just for the Union, but also for the principle of human equality. So that's kind of an interesting point. You do need to be familiar with what I just said about the Gettysburg Address. It's a very famous speech, and probably the most interesting part, and the part that you're most likely to be tested on, is that the focus of Lincoln's speech, which was also very short, it was only a couple minutes, was the fight for the principle of human equality and the principles espoused by the Declaration of Independence, not necessarily slavery, right? So he's talking much more about equality. Obviously, slavery is implied. That's what a lot of the war is about. But the focus is on the Declaration of Independence and equality for all people and all citizens. So the period after the Civil War, which is usually 1865 to 1877, was called the Reconstruction period. Abraham Lincoln started planning for the Reconstruction of the South during the Civil War, as Union soldiers occupied huge areas of the South. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. Okay, so with the Reconstruction, so we have three big amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And they're adopted between 1865 and 1870, which are the 5 years immediately following the Civil War. The 13th Amendment, which is proposed and ratified in 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except for those duly convicted of a crime. The 14th Amendment, which was proposed in 1866 and ratified in 1868, addressed citizenship rights and equal protection of the laws for all people. And the 15th Amendment, which was proposed in 1869 and ratified in 1870, prohibits discrimination in voting rights of citizens on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So you really need to know the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that as a group, those are referred to as the Reconstruction Amendments, and then you need to know each of those amendments, what they do. So what we have right here on the screen is enough. You don't have to know any more than that, but you do need to know that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment addressed citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment dealt with voting rights. And then we also have the Black Codes. In the United States, the Black Codes were laws passed by Democrat-controlled southern states in 1865 and 1866 after the Civil War. These laws had the intent and the effect of restricting African Americans' freedom and of compelling them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. Segregation of public facilities is an example of a Black Code. The defining feature of the Black Codes was broad vagrancy law, which allowed local authorities to arrest freed people for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor.